Invasion from Ronald Wright's Stolen Continents. Savages we call them because their manners differ from ours, which we think the perfection of civility. They think the same of theirs. Benjamin Franklin, 1784. The Iroquois history of their invasion by Europe is recorded, like that of the Cherokees, as a long series of negotiations with the invaders. Many early speeches have survived, partly because of better record-keeping in the northern colonies, but also because the Iroquois were the finest orators of North America. The thrust of the Six Nations diplomacy was to keep both foreign powers unsure of Iroquois intentions, to extract the maximum in trade goods, to yield the minimum of territory, and to keep the encroaching squatters at bay for as long as possible. To the north of Iroquois, Lake Ontario provided a natural barrier, and the French were, in any case, half-hearted settlers. During the 150 years that France controlled Canada, only 27,000 migrants came from the mother country. They multiplied to 65,000 by 1760, but that was nothing compared to the numbers of British in New York and Pennsylvania. Diplomacy and politics are always theater. In oral societies, whether the Six Nations of the Iroquois or the Seven Kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxon England, this is axiomatic. Every legal deed had to be done before witnesses, the more the better. Anyone who reads the minutes and transcripts of conferences involving the Six Nations will be impressed by the way Europeans were forced to adopt Amerindian Protocol, American Indian Protocol. They had to acquire a rich metaphorical language, planting the tree of peace, straightening the roads, sweeping the house, stoking the council fire, and so forth, to fix each clause in memory, like headings and illustrations in a text. Some of this imagery, burying the hatchet, for example, came into general English usage. Europeans had to learn the intricacies of making and presenting wampum and other gifts, reciprocity being the key to all discourse. They had to remember the correct kinship terms that signified political status. They were given names to be passed, like the sachem titles of the League, from the one incumbent to the next. Iroquois always called the governor of New York Corollaire, the name of the Dutchman with whom they negotiated the original two-row wampum treaty in the 1640s. The governor of Quebec was Onontio, a translator of Montagamani, the first incumbent's name, and the pens of Pennsylvania's were dubbed onus, an Iroquois word for pen. To these metaphors, the British added one of their own, the covenant chain, a symbol of the ties between indigenous nations and the crown. Just as roads had to be swept and straightened, the chain had to be cleaned of rust, burnished with loving hands, lengthened with extra links, mended with new ones, and so forth. William Bull, who represented South Carolina at an Albany conference, gives an idea of what these negotiations were like. There were about 130 men from the Six Nations. Their wives and children made up above 300. They made huts for themselves on the hills. Here they had fresh meat, bread, and beer served to them every day, the cost of each amounting to 85 pounds our currency. On 4th of July, they condoled with His Excellency on the death of the Prince of Wales, and His Excellency returned the condolences on the loss of several of the warriors and sachems, for they had never proceeded upon business till the ceremony of condolence is performed. On the 6th, the governor sat in a chair in the street before his house, and the council of this province and the commissioners from South Carolina, Boston, and Connecticut being seated on each side of him, and the Indian secretary seated at a table before him, and the Six Nations seated on logs placed in the street. He then cautioned them against the artifices of the French, and proposed to them to destroy the French fort at Niagara on their land. On the 8th of July, they answered the governor paragraph by paragraph. Of the great many orators who spoke for the Six Nations in the mid-18th century, Canastastego, the brawny Onondaga, who influenced Benjamin Franklin, was the star. Franklin was the government printer at the time and returned the favor by publishing transcripts of the conferences at which Canastastego and other speakers shone. Snapped up by both whites and Indians, they also sold well in faraway London as specimens of Americana. Tough, wily, and convivial, Canastastego used humor and an effective ingredient of his veiled threats. When the English produced rather stingy tots of rum at the end of some difficult talks, he contrasted the generosity of the foreign powers. "It turned out, unfortunately, that you gave us it in French glasses," he said. "We now desire you will give us some in English glasses," which must have left the English wondering just how familiar Canastastego was with the size of French tumblers and whether the names of the glasses were reversed when they talked to the business in Quebec. Basically, he's playing both sides. Canastatego's years of wrangling with Penn brothers bore little fruit until open war broke out between the French and the British in the early 1740s. This is before the French and Indian War. War between the invaders was always the Iroquois' most advantageous time, for their forces were still strong enough to decide the outcome. After dropping his usual threats, Conestotago turned even the paucity of his gifts into a demonstration of what settlers and their livestock were doing to Indian hunting grounds. We know our lands are now becoming more valuable. The white people think we do not know their value, but we are sensible that the land is everlasting, and the few goods we receive for it are soon worn out and gone. Besides, we are not well used with respect to the lands still unsold by us. Your people daily settle on these lands and spoil our hunting. We must insist on your removing them, for they do great damage to our cousins the Delawares. It is customary with us to make a present of skins whenever we renew our treaties. We are ashamed to offer our brethren so few, but your horses and cows have eaten the grass our deer used to feed on. George Thomas, deputy governor of Pennsylvania, replied that efforts had already been made to remove illegal squatters. Some magistrates were sent, and we thought no persons would presume to stay after that, he said glibly. Conestotago was not so easily fobbed off. These persons who were sent did not do their duty. So far from removing the people, they made surveys for themselves, and they are in league with the trespassers. Don't fool us. In June 1744, 2 years after the above exchange, representatives of the 6 nations of the Iroquois, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland, met at Lancaster, Pennsylvania, for a fortnight of hard bargaining. It was here, on July 4th, oddly enough, that Conestotago recommended the Iroquois style of union to the colonies. That speech, momentous in retrospect, was overshadowed at the time by his address of June 26th to the governor of Maryland. In this, he painted a large canvas, the entire history of contact between the natives and the invaders of North America. His outrage is the same outrage Aboriginal leaders express today when they find that the white man's self-serving pieces of paper carry more weight in our white courts than the huge fact that the Indians were in America first since time immemorial. When you mentioned the affair of land yesterday, you went back to old times and told us you had been in possession of the province of Maryland above 100 years. But what is 100 years in comparison to the length of time since our claim began, since we came out of this ground? For we must tell you that long before 100 years, our ancestors came out of this very ground, and their children have remained here ever since. You came out of the ground in a country that lies beyond the seas. There you may have just claim, but here you must allow us to be your elder brethren, and the lands to belong to us before you knew anything of them. It is true that above 100 years ago the Dutch came here in a ship. During all this time the newcomers, the Dutch, acknowledged our rights to this land. After this the English came into the country and, as we were told, became one people with the Dutch. About 2 years after their arrival of the English, an English governor came to Albany, and finding what great friendship subsisted between us and the Dutch, he approved it mightily, and desired to make us strong as a league, and to be upon as good terms with us as the Dutch were. Indeed, we have had some small differences with the English, and during these misunderstandings, some of their young men would, by way of reproach, be every now and then telling us that we should have perished if they had not come into this country and furnished us with blankets and hatchets and guns and other necessary things to support life. But we always gave them to understand that they were mistaken, that we lived before they came among us, and as well or better, if we may believe what our forefathers told us. We then had room enough and plenty of deer which was easily caught, and though we had not knives or hatchets or guns, such as we have now, yet we had knives of stone, and hatchets of stone, and bows and arrows, and those served our uses as well then as the English ones do now. We are now straitened and sometimes in want of deer, and liable to make many other inconveniences since the English came among us, and particularly from that pen and ink work that is going on the table. The Onondaga stopped and wagged his finger at the secretary jotting down his words. Most Iroquois came away from the Treaty of Lancaster feeling that they had done well. They were laden with 1,100 pounds worth of trade goods, for which they had relinquished some land occupied by non-Iroquois, over whom they may or may not have had been overlords. Not a bad haul for a dubious claim. So they met a trade-away land that they didn't even really control. With this and the concomitant brightening of the covenant chain, they felt they were in a strong position to defend Iroquois during any forthcoming hostilities and possibly to profit from them. But both sides had promised more than they could deliver. The colonial governments could not control their unruly settlers, who were in fact always on the move, driven by a predatory shoal of land sharks at their backs. And when the Franco-British War became serious, the French and Indian War, the Iroquois were unable to bring their western allies to the British camp. Indian hating still exists, and no doubt will continue to exist so long as Indians do. Herman Melville, 1857, from Pittsfield, Massachusetts, where he lived. No prominent Mohawks were present at the Lancaster talks in 1744, an absence that marked the beginning of a rift in the Longhouse that persists to this day. Just a quick note, the Mohawks were part of the Iroquois, but they weren't actively at the talks in Lancaster. The Longhouse refers to the union of the Six Nations of the Iroquois Nation, Mohawks included. So the Iroquois had 6 different nations within this alliance. As the eastern doorkeepers, sandwiched between Albany and Quebec, the Mohawks had the closest contact between both English and French. This gave them great diplomatic and trading leverage, but also exposed them to the brunt of such frontier ills as disease, rum, and squatter invasions. By the 1740s, many had started to withdraw from their old southern heartland along the Mohawk Valley, which runs westward from Albany to within a few miles of Oneida Lake. Some of them had been moving north for a century, repopulating towns along the St. Lawrence River, where their ancestors had greeted Cartier, the French explorer. The most strategic of these was Kanawaki, or Kanadawaga, clustered around the Catholic mission on the south bank across from Montreal. 6,000 Mohawks live there to this day, and in 1990, unfinished business with the white invader led them to blockade one of the city's freeways for 2 months. Mohawks thus had a foot planted in each colonial camp, British and French, a high-stakes game that made them the rest of the Six Nations uneasy, especially the important Senecas and Onondaga tribes. The Mohawks thought Conestoga, for all his fine words, had made a serious mistake at Lancaster, trading away too many powers. In 1750, the Onondaga statesman died suddenly. Although he was well past 60, many thought his death suspicious, especially when the Mohawk leader, Thananoiga, new to the whites as Hendrick, nimbly stepped into his shoes. Hendrick was one of the 4 Mohawk chiefs who had gone to England to visit Queen Anne in 1710, but the British now suspected him of being a French sympathizer. This he denied, yet exploited. In 1753, Hendrick, again a native, went to New York City and complained bitterly about the British neglect to the governor, Admiral George Clinton. We come here to remind you of the ancient alliance agreed on between our respective forefathers. We were united together by a covenant chain, and now it seems likely to be broken, not from all faults, but yours. My heart aches because we Mohawks have always been faithful to you, the British, especially in this last year, in this last war, when there was no assistance given you, but only by our nations. And had the war lasted some time longer, we would have torn the Frenchmen's hearts out. You sit in peace and quietness here, while we are exposed to the enemy. It is by your means that we stand every hour in danger. Hendrick, again the Mohawk leader, then moved to the matter of settler encroachments and abuses in the Mohawk Valley. When our brethren the English came among us, we gave and sold them lands, and have continued to do so ever since, but it now seems as if we had no lands left for ourselves. We desire our brother, Governor Clinton, to let us see the patents, the title deeds. By this we shall know who has cheated us. I'm going to tell you how many persons we designed to drive away from our lands. Vis-a-vis Barclay, Pritchett's wife, who lives just by us, and who does us a great deal of damage by selling us liquors, and by that means making us destroy one another. We let her have a little spot of land, and she takes it more and more every year. At last, Hendrick came to the sting and the tail of the speech. The Six Nations had, he said, received wampum from the French with an invitation to talk. Of course, he added craftily, the Gallic intent was doubtless to invite the Mohawks to a feast and murder them. He's saying, look, we've got an offer from the French. Now, look, we don't trust them, the Gallic, the French. We're probably going to just invite us to a feast and kill us. But, if you give us what we want, we won't go talk to them. Despite the seriousness of this, Governor Clinton did not give Hendrick a good answer. The Mohawk went away in anger. When we came here to relate our grievances about our lands, we expected to have something done. And, brother, you tell us that we shall be redressed at Albany? But we know them so well, we will not trust to them, for they are no people but devils. The covenant chain is broken. You are not to expect to hear us any more, and brother, we desire to hear no more of you. So the British and the Indians have split, right before what becomes known as the French and Indian War. When news of this reached London, Clinton's superiors were appalled. He had broken with the Iroquois on the very eve of what became known in America as the French and Indian War, and in Europe, where it began 2 years later as the 7 Years' War. When we consider of how great a consequence the friendship and alliance of the Six Nations is to all His Majesty's colonies and plantations in America in general, as well as to New York in particular, the Lords of Trade wrote to Clinton, we cannot be greatly concerned. Fatal consequences must inevitably follow from a neglect of them. To patch things up, the British sent William Johnson, a trader and agent who had lived in the Mohawk Valley for years, to Hendrick with gifts, promises, and an invitation to the Albany Congress of 1754, which you guys might remember from the Homer quiz and Chapter 6. Despite the best efforts of Ben Franklin, who aired his scheme for an Iroquois-style union of the colonies, the Albany Congress failed to produce concerted action against the French. The Crown then appointed the vain and drunken General Edward Braddock to be commander-in-chief of all British forces in North America. Braddock, who had little use for colonists and less for Indians, alienated the Iroquois just as he had the Cherokees. When the British were routed at Pittsburgh in 1755, Scarrouty, an Oneida chief, then let fly about arrogant brass from the old country. Brother, it is now well known to you how unhappily we have been defeated by the French. We must let you know that it was the pride and ignorance of that great general that came from England. He is now dead, but he was a bad man when he was alive. He looked upon us as dogs and would never hear anything that was said to him. We often endeavored to advise him and to tell him of the danger he was in, but he never appeared pleased with us, and that was the reason that a great many of our warriors left him and would not be under his command. Those that came over from the great seas are unfit to fight in the woods. Let us go ourselves. We that came out of this ground, we may assured to conquer the French. In response to such criticism, the Crown set up a Department of Indian Affairs with two divisions, north and south. William Johnson, now Sir William, was chosen to head the northern half, making him the counterpart of the Cherokees' old friend, John Stuart. The choice was popular with the Mohawks. "We love him, and he is us," said Hendrick's brother. The department worked tolerably well as a liaison with the Six Nations, but was powerless to restrain encroaching settlers, one of whom was devious old Johnson himself. He set himself up in the style of Johnson Hall, a grandiose Georgian mansion in the heart of the Mohawk Valley, about 50 miles west of Albany. There he met and married Molly Bryant, elder sister of the remarkable boy Joseph Brant, the Mohawk war chief who would opt for Britain in the Revolutionary War. By October 1758, the tide of war was turning in favor of the British. Despite all their bluster and assurances of support, the Six Nations had remained effectively neutral until then. Finally, in 1759, Johnson got the Senecas to destroy Fort Niagara, the French stronghold on the limestone neck between Lakes Erie and Ontario. Later that same year, Wolfe took Quebec in a brutal campaign that cost him his own life. Lord Geoffrey Amherst then took Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain, giving him control of the water corridor from New York to Montreal. And in September of 1760, Kanawaki Mohawks ferried a British army across Lachine Rapids, and Montreal capitulated without bloodshed. With the French conquered, Indians throughout eastern North America began to hear rumors that the British would now turn against them. There was similar talk within the Six Nations of driving all whites from Iroquois. This mistrust was aggravated by General Braddock's successor, Amherst, who the town of Amherst is named after. Always an Indian hater, he abandoned his native allies, leaving many to starve amid the wreckage of cornfields and orchards destroyed in the fighting. He stopped their payments and did nothing to halt renewed settler intrusions. These provocations added up to another war, one linked to the name of the Ottawa chief Pontiac, though he was only one of its leaders, and it became transformed into a holy war. The indigenous peoples were in the midst of a crisis that threatened every aspect of their lives. They had experienced 2 centuries of population collapse and accelerated cultural change. Old ways no longer worked. New ones required the adoption of repugnant alien values. The future offered them survival, if it offered survival at all, only at the exorbitant price of becoming like the invaders. Such a predicament had been faced by many peoples at many times in history, though nowhere on earth as it has been faced by such a scale and for so long as in the Americas. A threat from which there seems to be no escape often triggers a religious response. Cultures, like individuals, become open to messages from God, resulting in what anthropologists call a revitalization movement or a crisis cult. A prophet offers a way, usually presented as a return to an ideal past, which is, in fact, a new way, synthesizing tradition and change. Such prophets may be doomed, like Joan of Arc, or they may change the world, like Jesus or Muhammad. In 1762, a Delaware named Neolin, the Enlightened, returned from a spiritual journey to the Creator's dwelling place. There, the Master of Life had shown him why his people suffered, and given instructions for revival. "I am the maker of heaven and earth, the trees, lakes, rivers, and men, and all that thou seest. And because I love you, you must do my will. You must avoid also that which I hate. I hate you to drink as you do, until you lose your reason. I wish you not to fight one another. The land on which you are, I have made for you, not for others. Wherefore do you suffer the whites to dwell upon your lands? Can you not do without them? Before those whom you call your white brothers had arrived, did not your bow and arrow maintain you? You needed neither gun, powder, nor any other object. The flesh of animals was your food, their skins your remnant. But when I saw you inclined to evil, I removed the animals into the depths of the forest. Drive from your lands the dogs in red clothing, the British. They are only an injury to you. When you want anything, apply to me. Do not sell to your brothers that which I have placed on earth as food. Become good, and you shall want for nothing. Nealon's preaching gave Pontiac and others planning the reconquest of North America exactly what any such movement needed: an ideology capable of inspiring extraordinary deeds and sacrifices. The message was carried from town to town, together with plans for a general rising in May 1763. Pontiac quietly dropping the taboo against steel and guns. Then will the Great Spirit give successes to our arms. Then he will give us strength to conquer our enemies, to drive them from hence, and recover passage to the heavenly regions which they have taken from us. Fort after fort fell to the insurgents. 2,000 settlers, most of them illegal squatters, were killed. The turning point, as so often is the contest for America, came with plague. But the scourge was no longer left in the hands of God. Lord Jeffrey Amherst secured his place in history as the inventor of modern germ warfare with this notorious command: infect the Indians with sheets upon which smallpox patients have been lying, or by any other means which may serve to exterminate this accursed race. Fort Pitt's commander offered to parley with besieging chiefs. He then made them a gift of contaminated blankets. The epidemic raged all summer. One by one, the leaders who survived it were compelled to sue for peace. The only positive outcome for the Indians was the Royal Proclamation Line of 1763, which, as noted in Chapter 4, sealed the fate of Britain's colonies by setting limits to a colonial system based on an expanding frontier. In 1768, the Fort Stanwix, which stood at the head of the Mohawk River in a place now called Rome, Iroquois ceded their land to the east and south. The Mohawk Valley passed into the hands of the Scots, driven from their ancestral homeland, Highland clearances.